So you may have heard the news. Fallout 76 just recently may have had what looks like it'll be some future DLC leak. And this leak is particularly interesting as it does look like it will be a return to Washington, D.C., aka the setting of Fallout 3. Which is that, in and of itself, that headline, that topic is a huge revelation and something to get extremely excited for in the future. But honestly, the coverage of this has been horrible. The reason this got so popular was one Reddit post was made about this a couple of days ago, and it just seems like many of the places to actually cover this just took the post at face value, did literally no additional investigation or research, as quite literally within 20 minutes of seeing this Reddit post and trying to dig a little deeper, I found way more information. In this video, I can give you the whole story, what this actually is, why on one hand you have to temper your expectations, but why on the other hand there is still something very exciting on the horizon, and there definitely could be a return to Fallout 3's Washington, D.C. But okay, let's back things up a little bit and explain what's going on here if you haven't been following things too closely. Right now with Fallout 76 thus far, all the DLC has taken place within the map of Appalachia, that exact same map we had since day one of the beta. For the DLCs thus far, they've added some new interior locations as well as some new places on the map, but otherwise the world space itself is largely the same. But it seems like they have plans and have had plans for a while for a DLC that will take us off the map. This originally being introduced on the 2020 roadmap, that in the form of expeditions that were supposed to be in the final slate of the Fractured Steel DLC. Now in reality, this entire column basically either got delayed or cancelled somewhat, but expeditions seem to have had one of the most interesting transformations, as it seems like Bethesda internally originally planned expeditions as smaller scale adventures off map, but as they worked on it, decided to make it a bigger DLC, and more recently in interviews they compare it to the likes of Far Harbor. So seemingly you will go to a totally new location and have a variety of things to do there. As such, since it got larger in scale, it was not actually even on the 2021 roadmap and is now planned as a 2022 feature, but seemingly a much bigger feature than it was originally planned to be back in 2020. So now going to this most recent leak, we find this post on Reddit that does read, the expedition cells that are currently in the game are only labeled as prototypes but are being used to test and add functionality to expeditions. We don't know if they're going to actually end up being used or not. There are a lot of cells that are fully featured, just not used, i.e. Mole Miner City, 76 PvP Playground. As soon as we have any concrete info as to what expedition cells will be available in game, we will make sure to post it. And then we have a variety of images showcasing these various cells. If you're not familiar, a cell is basically just a chunk of world space in Fallout. And if you look at these images, they don't immediately say much. You could interpret a few different things, but it's kind of hard to piece it all together, except for one image that looks very familiar. That being this particular one, which you have a couple of different angles of, that seems to be of Washington, D.C., specifically DuPont Circle. And if you hop into Fallout 3, you can clearly see this is a pretty accurate recreation of that. There are definitely some differences, but it's kind of a rough outline of almost the exact same thing layout-wise. So then many people immediately began to conclude that, okay, the expeditions, this big new world space we're going to, will be Washington, D.C. That's the big DLC we'll probably get in 2022. And that's kind of right, but there's a lot of clarification around all of this. Firstly, basically all of this information, this entire post is coming from a second or even third-hand user. This is not the person to take these images originally, and in fact, there are several other images out there of some of these places that are not included, and there's a couple of important details that are definitely left out that I want to clarify everyone on. So these cells are actually probably on your computer right now if you have Fallout 76. This is more akin to a data mine than a hack. Basically, there was a third-party program used to gain access to these locations. This was only done recently, but these cells in reality have been in the game files for a long time. It's hard to pinpoint exactly, but over 6 months, and seemingly in between 6 months to a year. So when looking at these, it's important to consider that this is pretty old content. It will probably not look exactly like this on release, but even further, these images are far from the whole picture in the sense that these are all different places. The cells themselves are called Proto Expo, and there are 5 different Proto Expos. The Washington, D.C. one is just one of these locations, but most of the other pictures are taken from a different area. So Proto Expo 1 is kind of just a generic little base. It's one of those structures you've seen probably in Fallout 4. I think there's one in Fallout 76 also. It's hard to really dissect exactly where this area is. Proto Expo 2, pretty simple. The DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. This is the one that definitely has had the most discussion and is without a doubt the most obvious. Proto Expo 3 could be a lot of things, but to me, with these 3 bridges, Chicago has a very similar style with those relatively short bridges as well as taller buildings around them. Proto Expo 4 is one that I couldn't dissect. It's a super urban area. It has this monorail that runs all throughout it. And then finally, the least complete with Proto Expo 5. It's another super urban area that, again, you really can't dissect much. It almost gives you New York City brownstone vibes, but it's kind of hard to determine just based off what we have here. So one of the things that may not be super clear from some of these videos or images is these are all super tiny locations. Like, they are very small chunks of world space that you get to the end to very quickly. Like, just doing a panning shot, you can see pretty quickly how close the edges are on each side. So with that in mind, what I think this actually is are some of the locations that were originally going to be used for the first rendition of Expeditions. We don't know much about what they actually planned for Expeditions, but based off what we know just overall, it seems like at first they were going to kind of be little off-map mini adventures. Not something DLC sized, but like you could go to the city and do a daily op there, but it would very much so be a condensed world space, not a vast area to explore, but something smaller. And that's basically what we have here, 5 different prototypes of those smaller areas. But it seems like at some point Bethesda changed it to make it so we'll have a much larger area to explore and do missions in. Again, like a Far Harbor, as they made that comparison more recently. But also in the most recent interview on Expeditions, they said they were narrowing down a location, as if they haven't actually picked one yet. Although likely by this point they probably have picked one location. So what follows is, I assume these are the original 5 prototypes for those locations, and now Bethesda is trying to determine which of the 5 will end up becoming a larger world space and the first off-map adventure for Fallout 76. I imagine these little areas we have right now are them just kind of getting in the early stages, blocking it out, seeing how it would look like, how it would feel, and then over time you iterate on the design and improve it or change it in various ways. But now when we actually get Expeditions, we'll probably have one of these locations and much larger, something closer to the scale of Far Harbor where there's quite a bit to explore and do. So to me, this is still super exciting in that we have a look at probably the list of options, and Bethesda likely chose one of these, Washington, D.C. being one of them. One of them definitely seems like it could be New York. In the early days of planning, Fallout 4 was actually going to take place in New York, so they have a bit of a history there. Seems like this one could definitely be a return to the Commonwealth with Boston, but not downtown Boston. This one definitely seems like it could be Chicago, and then overall, if you guys have any ideas for these in the comments as to where they are located, I'd love to hear. But the reason to get incredibly excited for all of this is it's going to be a super interesting setting, and for me, I think the most potential is definitely there with either a Boston or Washington, D.C., in the sense that Fallout 76 takes place almost 200 years before the events of these other games. Fallout 3, for example, took place in the year 2277. Fallout 76 right now is in the year 2103. Let's just assume it jumps a year ahead with the next DLC to 2104. That would be a 173-year difference between the games. You'll see vast differences in the world space between them. You could probably have some ancestors to other characters or some ghoulified character that survived. Even just in that comparison at DuPont Circle. If you look on the right side, you can see in Fallout 3, it looks like that building is very much so destroyed. But in this hypothetical Fallout 76 rendition, 173 years earlier, it doesn't look quite as destroyed. Getting to witness a city that just broke down. It's just only 28 years after the bombs dropped. Post-nuclear society isn't even established yet like we see it in other games. Not to mention, depending on where some of these locations are, it does open up that possibility around factions and the story. Largely this time frame Fallout 76 takes place in is totally unwritten ground. Bethesda can kind of do whatever they want to a certain degree, and although they've been kind of leaning on some of those familiar factions, the Raiders, the Brotherhood of Steel, they could just make totally new factions with a ton of depth history, and I think that'd be a really cool potential with this one, or even ancestors to characters we meet later on. All of those cool ideas or concepts that never came to fruition with the original release of Fallout 76 could definitely be revisited now with this new area. With that said, hopefully this video gets you more informed and is just a more accurate portrayal of what is actually going on here. If you enjoyed this one, you can leave a like on this video, but until next time, I thank you all again for watching, and I hope to see you all later.